Thank you, Mr Chair.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'll hand over to Mr Wallahan.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor. After the Jobs Summit, the government flagged an increase in migration to 195,000 per annum. Just have a four-part question. Have you modelled that? What is the impact on employment or unemployment? What is the impact on inflation? And then finally, the impact on rent and house prices.
Good questions. Perhaps I can share my kind of perspectives here. I think opening up the borders again and having immigration resume is incredibly important for the country's longer run prospects. So this is how I think about immigration, that Australia has benefited hugely from immigration. Almost 50% of the population were born overseas or have one parent who was born overseas. It's brought a dynamism to our country that very few other Western countries have. So I think it's one of our key national assets. So that's how I think about kind of immigration. It's the long-term benefits we get from it rather than in the short term. But in the short term, from my perspective, the focus needs to be on getting people with skills that are in short supply. Because I hear many businesses say they want to expand, they want to invest, but they can't get the people to do the expansion and the investment. And that's creating bottlenecks in the economy, and if we can blast through those bottlenecks with more people, we'll have higher output and higher income. So we need to focus on skills. I'm not sure that higher immigration has much effect on the unemployment rate. If you think about it in the kind of the perspective of an individual business, it's pretty clear. You can't undertake an investment, you can't hire a worker, so you get a worker from overseas and things look better for you, and the labour market constraints ease. But when that worker is finished working for you, they go home, they've got to live somewhere, they've got to eat, they go to the doctor, they go out and entertain themselves, maybe their children need to get educated, and when they do all those things, that creates additional demand for labour. So the worker comes in and supplies more labour for the firm, but when they go home, they create extra demand for labour in the economy. So at an aggregate level, I don't think immigration really is going to make that much of an effect on the overall dynamics in the labour market or the unemployment rate. But it's incredibly important in delivering skills to people, for businesses, and for the longer run prospects for the country. So I don't think it really has much effect on inflation or unemployment in the short run, other than to the extent it can ease the supply bottlenecks, and because you get people with the right skills.
Thank you. I want to take you to an answer you gave Ms Spender about housing affordability. You downplayed the role of interest rates, and I'm sorry if I verbal you, but I wrote down, you said there isn't anything to do with the Reserve Bank or interest rates. I apologise if I've got that wrong.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? Because I said the high level, the structural, the fact we've got kind of structurally high housing prices isn't doing anything with the Reserve Bank. Full responsibility for the cycle around that high level. Sorry.
No, that's all right.
Yep.
There's a 2019 RBA discussion paper written by Trent Saunders and Peter Tulip. It's titled A Model of the Australian Housing Market. And in the abstract, it says, we find that low interest rates explain much of the rapid growth in housing prices and construction over the past few years. How do you reconcile that abstract with what you've given today?
Yeah, that's, I think they're, and Lucy can come in here if it's helpful, they're talking about the decline in real interest rates.
Sure.
Which isn't something the Reserve Bank, I mean, we're the ones who actually deliver the level of interest rates, but we're really responding to broader forces which have levered lower real interest rates in the global economy, and when you have lower real interest rates, all asset prices go up, and that's what I think they're referring to. It's the lower real rates coming from global developments, and again, while we get the blame for that, we're just the institution that's delivering the lower nominal interest rates because of what's happened in the globe.
So yeah, just to expand on that, so the past few years, so there's the cyclical piece, so that's the bit we're claiming responsibility for, and that's actually what they're talking about there is explained. There was a cyclical increase in prices in that sort of more recent period, but Phil's also right that there is there are two things going on in the long term as well, and one is that the decline in nominal and real interest rates over multiple decades, primarily in the 90s, did mean that there was a level shift in the ratio of houses prices to income. That doesn't actually change affordability. And this is long-standing economics back to Modigliani, and we've written about this many, many times. But essentially, because inflation is lower and because the equilibrium real interest rate is lower for global reasons, that means you can service a bigger mortgage on the same repayment. So in that sense, housing affordability hasn't changed, but it maps into a higher price. So that was a one-off level shift. That was mostly completed by about 04, 05. And what we've seen since then has been mostly cycling around a new higher level in relation to income. And even more so that once you adjust for offset accounts, actually the household debt to income ratio has been pretty constant since about 2005. So in that sense, there was a level shift, which is explained by interest rates because nominal interest rates and real interest rates both came down. Disinflation and deregulation, all of the downward forces on the neutral real interest rate play into that. And then the other component is, yes, the cyclical movement of interest rates does have a large bearing on the cyclical movement of housing prices around their longer term trend.
Governor, you've been quite frank today on the need for structural reform, so thank you for that, particularly in terms of productivity. I'm interested in your views on the rates of home ownership, particularly for Australia's largest generation, often called Millennials, those born between 1981 and 1996. How do you see us increasing the percentage of Millennials owning homes?
How do I see us doing it? I see it's going to be pretty challenging. I think for that to happen, it requires, I think, a lower level of housing prices relative to people's income. For housing prices to grow more slowly than income for a while, to make it more feasible for young people to buy housing. And that comes back to the structural policies that I talked about before. It's urban design, the type of dwellings that we build, perhaps the tax arrangements, the transport system. Because one reason we have a high value of land embedded in dwellings is because we've underinvested in transport. And transport can increase the supply of well-located land. That's what it does. And if you increase the supply of well-located land, the value of land embedded in any particular dwelling will be lower. So in previous committees, I've talked about the best housing policy is a transport policy. It's tax, transport, and urban design. And I think if we're really serious about lowering the cost of housing relative to income, they're the things we've got to tackle. Interest rates, we raise them for a while and housing prices come down, so it's a bit more affordable, but it's not a sustainable solution, is it? Because it's just cycling around this higher level. And the other dynamic that's playing out, as you know, is the bank of mum and dad, where effectively houses get passed from generation to generation, which is fine if you can access the bank of mum and dad and your parents kind of pass the house or income through to you. But there are many Australians who aren't in a position to do that. So not as the central bank governor, but as an Australian, I worry a lot about that we're reinforcing, making worse the existing distribution of wealth in society through the housing market. And so the inability to address zoning, taxation and transport has really, I think, negative effects, longer-term effects on the society. But that's not my day job, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to share that.
Thank you. I think that's becoming our day job. So, further to Mr. Van Manen's question on APRA and inflation, I just had a slightly different take on APRA. It's a narrower question. APRA required retail banks to include buffers for new mortgages to ensure that unsustainable loans weren't issued during the COVID-era interest rates. Those buffers are now appearing to be modest. Do you think they were sufficient, and do you think further upward revision for new loans is required?
Do you mind if I ask Michelle to answer that question, because that was kind of her area of the bank up until recently?
Yeah, sure. So you're talking about the mortgage serviceability buffer that was, so the way APRA, like the banks, or require the banks to operate, is to have a floor serviceability rate, if you like. So when interest rates were really low, banks were effectively required to say, could they still pay it back at a much higher interest rate? The buffer was 2.5, then they raised it to 3, APRA raised it to 3. 3 is around about what other countries have in terms of these sorts of serviceability buffers. And what we're observing now, of course, as interest rates rise, is that the serviceability buffer is on top of a higher interest rate. So I don't think there's a suggestion that we need an even higher buffer. I think the buffer is or the serviceability buffer is providing what's required, and it's worked in the past in the sense that, as we discussed earlier, many households, even though interest rates have gone up, not all households, but many households have found they do have space because the space was built in the first place. So.
Thank you. Just want to go to the role of fiscal and monetary policy. What would be the result, and it's to you, Governor, what would be the result of tightening monetary policy, as we're doing, but increasing fiscal expenditure? How do you think that would play out in terms of inflation?
Well, it would all depend upon the degree, wouldn't it? I mean, we're tightening monetary policy, but if there was a very significant fiscal expansion now, that would put more pressure on aggregate demand, and the conversation we were having before was stronger aggregate demand's putting upward pressure on prices. So that would mean higher interest rates. But it really talks about the degree.
Sure.
How much extra fiscal stimulus might or might not be given. But,
would they be pulling and pushing against each other?
I mean, hypothetically they could, couldn't they? But I don't want to speculate what's in the budget, but there's a state of the world where fiscal developments are unhelpful for us, but I'm not predicting that state of the world, but conceptually it's possible, isn't it? Let's hope we don't find ourselves in that state of the world. That isn't to say that there can't be some measures to alleviate the cost of living pressures that households are feeling within the budget envelope, but we're tightening interest rates, so it'd be unhelpful to have fiscal expansion.
Thank you. And just one final question, Chair, if that's all right. We've seen globalisation get wound back for a variety of reasons, and globalisation has and integration has been a deflationary force for some time. How do you see that playing out long term in terms of inflation? Well,
long term inflation is determined by central banks. Our job will be easier or harder depending upon what's going on in the global economy. In the last 20 years, globalisation, increased global supply from China, made our jobs a bit easier. So if that trend reverses and productivity growth is low, our job's going to be harder. So it's not just deglobalisation, it's slower productivity growth and the demographics. Those things all mean slower growth in our real incomes, and our job of containing inflation is probably a bit harder, but ultimately the central banks determine the rate of inflation.
Thank you, Governor, and thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. So I'll hand over now